The format today is will be on the record. If we could turn off our cell phones, I'd appreciate that. We're honored today to be in the Gallup headquarters, and I'd like to thank my friend John Clifton for putting this together for us, and Nathan Went, who helped put this together. And John will lead us off with a view from a bird's eye view of the perspectives of locals within East Africa, of the environment for business, the environment for growth in East Africa from a Gallup perspective. Once he's done, then we'll get into our panel, and I'll introduce them as we go. Of course, you've got their bios there. We are on the record, and it's being taped, and so just keep that in mind as we go. And John, would you like to lead us off?
Thank you, Jim, and good morning. Welcome to Gallup. I just wanted to make a few remarks quickly about some of the information that we're collecting in a number of the countries that we'll be discussing today. So with that, before I dive into the data, I did just want to show exactly what the framework looks like in terms of the information that Gallup collects in virtually every single country every year. So by way of background, Gallup does an annual survey in roughly 140 countries every single year. We do data collection via phone in developed countries, Western Europe, United States, Canada, Japan, Singapore, Australia, New Zealand, etc. But for the most part, in every other single country in the world, we're doing face-to-face interviewing. And the other big piece is that the interviewing that we're conducting is nationally representative, so that the data that we're looking at in Tanzania, Ethiopia, Kenya, and Somaliland is representative of the entire country or economy. That's a big departure from a lot of the data that is collected from countries, because sometimes you'll see when a survey is conducted, it's only in the capital cities. And one of the challenges is the capital city doesn't represent the entire country. The information that we'll be looking at today is representative of the entire country. So when we're doing these surveys, which we've implemented this process known as the Gallup World Poll in 2006. So we have trends in Kenya and Tanzania dating back that many years, and we'll look at some of those trends today. But the important thing is, what are the indicators that we're looking at? Gallup built a process with some of the top behavioral economists in the world, including Danny Kahneman, Angus Deaton, Alan Kruger, and this is what we built with those partnerships. We call this the macroeconomic path, a behavioral economic model for the well-being of societies. And you can see at the very base of this is what we labeled law and order, and that's one of the areas that we're going to dive into a few countries today to discuss. What is the current state of law and order in a particular country? And again, by way of background, to grossly oversimplify how countries quantify what the current state of crime is in a particular country, they look at two indicators. One is how many people have been arrested. The challenge with that is if you add police, arrests go up. But that doesn't necessarily mean crime went up. And the other thing is how many people have reported to the government, to the police, that they've been mugged or assaulted. Again, the challenge with that is not every society, possibly like Washington, D.C. here, not everyone reports that something's happened to them. So again, that can be a challenge with crime statistics. So one thing we did is we got the actual information, but we also wanted to get the perception of safety. Because the best leaders in the world don't want to make a country safe. They also want to make the people within that country feel safe. And so we've quantified both of those things. You can see, again, this is our behavioral model, food and shelter, institutions and infrastructure. That's another place that we want to look at today. Because one of the big things in terms of investors, when people are looking at what's the climate in a country, they're looking at what does the judiciary look like? What are the perceptions of the government? But one big thing is corruption widespread within that country? And so we ask, and we get the opinions of people within those countries, whether or not they think corruption is widespread. Good jobs, we've taken a look at unemployment, and we have a different statistic that we use. But the main one that we're going to look at today is well-being. This is a really interesting metric. There are a lot of leaders that are giving pushback on this particular metric because they say, I need hard data. I need hard data like traditional economic metrics, GDP per capita, unemployment. that type of thing. But there's been another group of leaders that say, I need more information because if anything happens in a particular area like Superstorm Sandy, GDP goes up. But that doesn't necessarily mean that well-being rises in tandem. In addition to that, if you build a cigarette factory or if you build a prison in the middle of a city, GDP will rise, but well-being did not in tandem. And so this is one of the ways that we've quantified this. So let's dive into the data. So we wanted to look at 3 quick data points. What is the current state in terms of crime within a few of the countries that we'll be discussing today? So one of the questions that we ask, again, this is in every single country in the world. They're asked in exactly the same order. So we asked, within the past 12 months, have you had money or property stolen from you or another household member? Now, there's 2 ways to look at this. One, what is the global rank? And the second piece, where is it headed? So if we look at the countries that we're discussing today, you can see here in Tanzania. Tanzania ranks 8th in the world. Our last survey was in 2011, and our first survey was in 2006. The trend is not favorable to Tanzania. Kenya has a similar trajectory. It's 5th in the world. Now, there are 2 bright spots in our discussion today of the countries that we're discussing. Ethiopia, the statistics have declined. Ethiopia was in the top quartile a few years ago, and now, as you can see here, only 18% of people say that they or someone in their household has been mugged or assaulted. Then the last one, of course, again, probably the brightest spot that we'll see in our data today is Somaliland. Gallup would like to survey all of Somalia, but the number 1 priority for when we're going into the data is the safety of our interviewers. We have not determined yet that it is safe enough for us to go into Mogadishu, so we only get into the Somaliland region, and that's why we're only reporting Somaliland today. Now, that's what's currently happening. There's another aspect on how do people feel, because the best leaders in the world don't just want to make the place safe, they want to make people feel safe. So what does that information look like? So one of the best indicators that we determined is, do you feel safe walking alone at night? Because traditional data might tell us that a place is safe, but people don't actually feel safe. And what we've learned is perception is reality, and the best leaders in the world know that. So what is the current state of the perception of fear or that behavior in the 4 countries that we're discussing today? Kenya, it parallels exactly what the traditional data of asking people whether or not they've had an incident or someone in their family has had an incident. You can see a very low number say yes, they feel safe walking alone at night, and Kenya's in the lower quartile. Tanzania, almost identical. 2 other data points, again, with safety and security. Ethiopia, we're getting good data from there. We do have a gap in our reporting from 2007 to 2012. So there could have been instances in there, but we weren't able to conduct surveys throughout that time. And the next piece, Somaliland, while it's in the upper half of the entire database, there is a negative trajectory. Again, really important for the analysis to not just look at what is the current rank, but what's the trajectory. There are 2 other things to look at today. One is corruption, and then the next piece is well-being, and I'll go to those quickly. One of the indicators that we found has the highest signal strength is to ask the general population this simple question: is corruption widespread through the government in this country or not? And we get really different data coming from the 4 countries that we're focused on today. Perhaps not a surprise, Tanzania ranks 2nd in the world. 95% of people believe that corruption is widespread throughout the government in Tanzania. If you look at Kenya's data, 4th, 93% believe that corruption is widespread throughout the government. Now, again, we're dealing with perception data, and it's really important to look at other countries in context. Because, again, many of us are familiar with American politics, and just as a baseline, 73% of Americans believe that corruption is widespread within the government here in the United States. So it's important to look at a baseline to say, what does that mean exactly, but again, responses are some of the highest. Third, as the data point that we focused on today, Somaliland, perceptions of corruption being widespread within the government. Again, it's very important that we ask it in an extreme way so that we can see differentiation within the data. But there is a negative decline. And then the last one, Ethiopia, we were not allowed to ask that question in our database. The last two data points have to do with well-being. What is the current state of the human condition? And by way of background, in addition to the challenges that just looking at traditional economic indicators, not giving us the full and complete picture on what the current state of the human condition is in every single country, if we look back to two of the best examples over the past 5 to 7 years, you'd looked at Egypt and Tunisia, two countries that had consistently increasing GDP per capita over a 5-year period in the lead up to the Arab Spring. In fact, Egypt experienced 50% growth in GDP per capita from 2005 to 2010. Both countries also had perfect growth in terms of the Human Development Index put out by the United Nations. Both showed a positive trajectory in the lead up to the Arab Spring. So when we look at our indexes, for example, thriving, we ask people, evaluate your life. Tell us what you think on a scale of 0 to 10, 0 being the worst possible life and 10 being the best possible life. Where do you stand today? And where do you think you'll stand in the next 5 years? These self-reported data then allow us to build indexes for us to make a determination on what we believe the percent of people are thriving in every single country in the world and what percent of people are suffering in every single country in the world. Because these data are new, it's good to look at a context and to look at real-world outcomes. Egypt, for example, starting back in 2006, 30% Gallup would have determined were thriving. In the lead-up to the Arab Spring, Gallup found that it was 11.5%, which put Egypt on par with the Palestinian territories. Today, that number is 6.9%, as our most recent pulse in Egypt at 6.9%. So where does that stand in the countries? And by the way, this metric does highly correlate with GDP per capita. So again, you're looking at a heat map. The brightest countries in the world, of course, have the highest percentage of people that are thriving, and the countries that are the darkest are the countries that have the lowest percentage of people that are thriving. So when we look at the countries that we're focused on today, you can see that Tanzania ranks as one of the lowest in the world at 6% thriving. But the interesting thing to keep in mind is what is the trajectory of these data? They're flat. The next piece is Kenya. The analysis is simple on these four. Again, very low. Ethiopia, 12%, a more positive trajectory since our first pulse, and Somaliland at 21%, which is a very bright spot, about on par with the global median. Now, here's the most interesting part. What would Gallup determine the percent of people are that are suffering? And this is the last data point, and then I'll send it back to Jim. The percent of people that are suffering in each of these countries, again, we use the same calculation on people making their own evaluation about their lives. What they evaluate it based on that 0 to 10 scale today, and then in 5 years. So here's the percent of people that Gallup would consider are suffering in each of these countries. Somaliland, which is probably the brightest spot when it comes to well-being in our 4 countries, is 150th, very low. Again, a metric that you'd want to be very low, and you can see the negative trajectory, which is very positive. Ethiopia, the percent that are suffering, also in decline. Again, when you think about the behaviors like fear, those are some of the things that play into overall well-being. It's not just money transactions. The last two, Kenya, very low, 95th. But again, here's probably the data point of most concern for all of them, which is Tanzania. At one point, Tanzania reached one of the highest points in terms of percentage of people that are suffering within Gallup's database, which is in 2009. 46%, almost half of people were suffering. Now, again, we've seen a negative decline in suffering, but we haven't seen the uptick in percentage of thriving, which means there's an overall swell of people within the middle in terms of that well-being. So those are some data points. Jim, I'll throw it back to you. And again, thank you for giving us the opportunity and taking an interest in some of our global indicators. Thank you.
As a great overview on your findings. perceptions within East Africa and some of the major countries within East Africa. What I'd like to do now is to get to our panelists and get their views from a wide variety of perspectives, both nationally and regionally. I'd like to start off with Abdetta Biane, who's the former Director of African Affairs in Ethiopia, and currently in Northwestern in Chicago. And sir, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I was curious when he was earlier saying about Somaliland. I was based in Somaliland as Ethiopia's representative for 4 years and a half until 2006. So I basically followed how Somaliland developed slowly its economy and the relative peace and stability that it has achieved. Of course, we should take into consideration that Somaliland is not yet a recognized state. The president from Mogadishu recently visited the US, Washington, and has been given recognition. Somalia as a whole, yes, is changing. It's dramatically changing, actually. Of course, there is an African Union peacekeeping mission, AMISOM, that has succeeded to remove Al-Shabaab, the extremist group, from Mogadishu and partly some parts of southern Somalia. The biggest challenge in the Horn of Africa was Somalia, actually, for the last 20 years. Since 1991, there was a state collapse, and somehow Somalia has created that image of the Horn of Africa in terms of peace and stability, the negative perception that. But starting last year, the transition was, in a way, made a new president to be elected, then a new prime minister and cabinet has been established. That process of a peaceful transition in Somalia will help understanding the Horn of Africa in a different perspective. Going back to Ethiopia, in my view, I have been in the foreign ministry for 20 years. I have witnessed how Ethiopia developed the last 20 years. It will always be challenging for African countries to be equated or to be analyzed based on what Western developments or European development endeavors are. But I think if we look into how Ethiopia developed and compare itself 20 years ago or 30 years ago, how it developed, what kind of infrastructures that we have in Ethiopia 20, 30 years, and what it is now, what it is delivering now, how many people were lifted out of poverty the last couple of years? What is the trajectory? What is the government thinking in terms of transforming the economy? I think it will give us the opportunity to understand the changes that are happening in Ethiopia. If people try to analyze Ethiopia based on other countries, it will not give you the right development perspective that is happening in Ethiopia. I think comparing Ethiopia between now and 20 years ago, 25 years ago, 15 years ago, even 5 years ago and now, will help you to get the grasp of what is really happening in Ethiopia. So Ethiopia is changing, and changing very fast. Even for me, it has been a year and a half now since I left the foreign ministry, doing my PhD in Chicago. Every time I go back home, I see changes in Ethiopia, very fast. The role of the government has transformed itself. Previously, Ethiopia was at war with itself, at war with its neighbors. Ethiopia, relatively now, is at peace with itself, at peace with its neighbors. The only challenge was in 1998 until 2000, where Ethiopia and Eritrea had a difficulty. But that has gone now. the balance of power has shifted in the Horn of Africa, somehow. If you look at Ethiopia's role regionally and within the continent, Ethiopia is the biggest provider of peacekeeping force for the UN. Ethiopia has a peacekeeping force not only in Darfur, it keeps peace between the south and the north. In Abyei, Ethiopia has an exclusive force that provides security for the south and north of Sudan, not to fight. Ethiopia is a key player in terms of making peace between the Sudan and the south. As you know, recently they were in Addis, and both leaders have committed themselves at least to implement those points that they agree on. Of course, both countries were at war for like 40 years. It is not an easy endeavor to make peace between them, to create the trust that you need between the North and the South. But the international community can help. The difficulty is, they call it anarchy in the world. International relations assumes that there is anarchy in the world because states have interests, etc., etc. But it can be handled. The anarchy can be handled. Both the North and the South, they have to understand that either they sing together or they swim together. If the international community gives that kind of message to the Sudanese can make peace. And Sudan is a very huge country that provides a lot of opportunity. But because there is no trust, the North is not sure whether it has to allow the South to ship its oil through its territories. Because once the North believes if the South gets money, it will use that money to undermine the North, especially the southern part of the North. That is the context in which the Sudanese are trying to resolve their problems. If you go between Ethiopia and Eritrea, yes, the problem is still there, but I don't think there will be a fighting between Ethiopia and Eritrea because the balance of forces have changed totally. So I don't believe there will be a war between Ethiopia and Eritrea. Why I'm raising these issues of the Horn is because one has to understand developments in the Horn of Africa in a perspective. There is a lot of opportunity. It's a very resource-rich area. Yes, it has image problem because the media portrays the way it wants. Look at how Chinese role in Africa is portrayed in the Western media. I will be surprised to see most of the products that you buy in the US, including Chicago, is made in China. Why should Africans, when they deal with China in terms of development, infrastructure development, other endeavors, are accused of being looted or something? That image, I think, will make the opportunities that the Horn of Africa provides to Western companies to come with their resources, to come with their wealth in terms of knowledge, in terms of new ideas, will affect the opportunity that the Horn of Africa can provide, because the way Chinese role is portrayed in the US and the way they are doing business in Africa is different. Look, which government in the Western Hemisphere will invest $250 million US and build the AU conference facilities for free? But Chinese are being accused for doing that. And I think it's not fair. I don't think it's fair. So there are opportunities. There is competition. I think the Horn of Africa provides that framework so that American companies, Western companies will have the opportunity to do a clean business. So I encourage people to understand the Horn of Africa from a perspective that what it was in 20 years ago, like, what is now? What are the opportunities? What is the trajectory? What is the government in Ethiopia thinking in terms of 2025? Is that vision achievable? It's challenging, of course, but even the World Bank and the IMF have started to say that it's achievable. It's challenging, but it's achievable. Because the government wants to take Ethiopia from a low-income country to a middle-income country in that perspective. The Ethiopian government has never invested time and resources to developing mineral sectors, the oil sectors, because of the implications that the oil sector has in terms of killing your economy in other sectors. But now I think the Ethiopian government will be happy, of course, to give concessions, to encourage others. Teddy and his company is doing a good job in that regard. I believe that getting the concessions this year will be better than next year, in my view, because the government will have more capacity next year in terms of looking at, oh, okay, if I take this process, this economic development in Ethiopia, like 2 years, 3 years from now, I will have the capacity to exploit the resources myself. So when they deal with new companies, it means they can present new preconditions, new resources, new extractive capacities from the companies. So taking the opportunity today, in my view, is better than next year. I doubt if the data that most research institutes claim on the Horn of Africa really reflects the reality. Even I'm not sure if the governments know exactly what's happening in their country. Ethiopia is changing even with a difficult understanding that people have. Is it really, you know, it's very difficult to really understand because the change is so fast, very fast, and unless you join it now, it is difficult to catch up. But the institutions that Western countries have, the capacities those companies have, will of course provide a lot of opportunity for them to invest. So the whole regional perspective is changing. Ethiopia is a key player in Somalia, a key player in making peace in Sudan and between Sudan and South Sudan. There is an agreement between South Sudan, Ethiopia, and Kenya to build a new port with infrastructures that connect them, rail, road transport, etc., which might cost $4 billion. I am sure the Chinese companies are going to win those concessions eventually, because the other companies are not moving, are not coming in full force, recognizing those facts. I think I took much of your time, maybe. Let me stop here, and then eventually in our discussions we can.
Thank you. We'll be able to pick it up in the discussions as well. Thank you. At this time, Teddy Ashinafi is the chairman of Southwest Energy in Ethiopia. He's also a member of the EastWest Institute board. Teddy, and we'd be interested to hear what your thoughts are from the ground perspective of someone that's making it happen in Ethiopia.
Sure. Okay, thanks very much, Jim. I think vis-a-vis the energy sector, there are two massive developments that are taking place. One is, certainly, we've all heard about the shale gas revolution in the United States, which will probably make the United States self-sufficient in energy in the next, say, 3 to 5 years, depending on who you talk to. And the second massive development, in my opinion, is East Africa oil and gas. I think we've seen the trend coming from Tanzania, and the gas that's being discovered in Tanzania is really awe-inspiring. I think we're at 50 trillion cubic feet of gas right now, and they keep drilling and keep finding more. So Tanzania has an opportunity to become the next Qatar, given its geographic location and the amount of gas that's being found. So And the trend is moving up. You have, of course, Uganda, Mozambique, Kenya. There was a recent discovery, and we're drilling. There's drilling being done in Ethiopia. So this year, I think, will be a very interesting year for Ethiopia oil and gas. So the trend is moving up, and I see three themes in this regard. One is, I think there's an opportunity for leadership in the development of these oil resources. And what I mean by leadership is essentially both the governments, the companies, and the civil societies have an opportunity to make sure that these oil and gas developments are done in a best practice manner. So there's really a chance for leadership all around. I think the second theme is the opportunity for regional integration. And as Abdetta mentioned, the LAPSAT, which is Lamu Port, South Sudan, Ethiopia corridor, will be essentially a cross-country, cross-sectorial collaboration, where one of the themes, of course, of the African Union this year is inter-Africa trade and regional integration. So this oil and gas resources that's being developed will be a catalyst for, I think, an opportunity to prosper thy neighbor as opposed to beggar thy neighbor. So that's a second theme that we see in the energy sector. And the third is, and Abdetta touched about this a little bit, is the geopolitical significance. There have been doubters about oil and gas in this region. For example, when I started my company, I went around, and there were a lot of 30-year veterans who told me there is no oil in East Africa. You're wasting your time. And they believed it, of course, because that was their cognitive bias. They've only seen gas in that region and a little bit of it. So, of course, it turns out that there is oil in East Africa, and probably quite a lot of it. And I think that trend is going to come to Ethiopia. So I think that there's going to be a massive geopolitical significance of whoever is going to be involved in that energy development process, and whoever is essentially has their hands on it. And clearly this opportunity has been given to, as Abdetta said, to the U.S. companies, but the U.S. companies have their certain constraints and so on and so forth. And I don't see them moving as much as you would think they would be moving in this area. While, of course, some of the eastern countries are certainly very interested. And whoever controls this area strategically is going to be controlling something that's close to the Straits of Al-Mandeb, which is a major choke point, where about 15 million barrels of oil per day goes through that choke point. So in my opinion, I think it's, if I were, let's say, Western institutions, I would certainly take a very, very close look at this emerging resource bonanza. And so three themes. I think there's an opportunity for leadership, both civil society, government, and business. Second, there is an opportunity for regional integration, these governments working together in making sure that these resources are developed correctly. And the third is a massive geopolitical influence that's going to arise from the development of these energy resources. Thank you.
Very clear and concise. Very good. Thank you. Dr. Raymond Gilpin from USIP, you have a broader regional perspective and also looking at sort of the humanitarian and civil society aspect of it. If you could give us your thoughts real quick, that would be fantastic.
Excellent. Thank you very much, and thanks to you, James, and EastWest Institute, and to Gallup for hosting this timely event. I believe that as I'll take my cue from Teddy, and this issue of a resource bonanza in East Africa, what are we actually talking about? It's really important to add and counting to any reserves number, because we're really not sure. Counting might mean adding or subtracting. But currently, we're talking about 28 billion barrels of recoverable reserves of crude in East Africa, 440 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. Put that in perspective, from a natural gas perspective, Mozambique, for instance, could become the world's the whole of the world's fifth largest reserves, behind Russia, Iran, Turkmenistan, and Qatar. That would be Mozambique in terms of natural gas. Currently, we have 50 different oil companies. National oil company, international majors, the mid-caps, small caps, they're all there. Because we're talking about a multi-billion-dollar investment scheme to bring these resources to market. Generally, when you think about oil and gas in Africa, two things just pop to mind. Transparency and corruption is one, and exploitation by the outsiders of these resources. But I see two different trends teeing up in East Africa. The first is that the nature of competition is meaning that the external parties who are entering East Africa are entering slightly differently than they did elsewhere on the continent, where it was a single company having a sweetheart deal with a particular country. We're seeing a lot more consortiums going into African countries. And markedly, most of these consortiums also include Chinese companies. So the perception of China going it alone, bulldozing, in East Africa it's different. You have a lot of consortia, and there's a lot more competition. There's a very interesting development where a British company, Cove Energy, wanted to sell their interests, and there was a bidding war that started between Shell and the Thai National Oil Corporation. And this is something that not just the outsiders, but African countries should take note of and use to their advantage. The second thing that I think is changing, will change in East Africa, is that the focus is going to shift from just transparency, i.e., are they going to be corrupt, to contractual compliance. The contracts for the oil, and particularly the gas deposits in East Africa, are going to be a lot more complicated, not just because of the number of people, number of entities in the consortia, but because of the nature of extraction and the way the market is structured. You have to get so many things right, so the contracting also becomes problematic. Very quickly, let me just run you through a number of risks I see and potential rewards. On the risk side, I think there are three categories of risks. You have the domestic risks, the regional risks, and the external risks. Domestically, I think we have the possibility that domestic control of the revenues accruing from these resources could lead to a politics of exclusion, where those in governance positions would exclude others because they have control. Second domestic risk is the risk of policy failure, particularly in the areas of taxation and nationalization. We're seeing hints of both. Taxation is a difficult one because while the countries would want to extract maximum revenue, there's also the problem that you could price yourself out of the market. For example, the average government take of profits worldwide is 67%, on average. Uganda is going above 80%. They could afford to do it now because of the amount of euphoria, but you have to think about looking regionally, it could make them slightly less competitive. There's also the risk of civil unrest, because in a lot of these areas, the deposits just so happen to be in contested areas. And that's going to have both domestic and regional implications. On the regional, and that parlays me to the regional risks, the border, the contentious border. There are a number of border issues, and I can elaborate during the Q&A if you'd like me to give you specific examples on how this would play out. There's also the regional risk of information sharing. My two colleagues have mentioned the possibility of the Lamu pipeline, but for the wealth of resources that are potentially in this area, you have zero infrastructure. And for most of the infrastructure to be profitable, you have to explore economies of scale, which would mean cross-border collaboration in not just the construction, but also the maintenance of these facilities. And this poses a significant challenge to, I liked your phrase, prosper thy neighbor. But you only prosper thy neighbor when thou worketh with thy neighbor. You see, and that's the challenge. The external challenges are going to come not from the usual mindset of external companies coming to exploit, but it is a really confusing and challenging thing to negotiate contracts, not just for the exploitation of the oil and gas reserves, but also for their sale. Okay, people think that we could probably just take the oil or the gas and sell it to the market. You really have to identify the markets, lock in the price, understand your value chain very well. And then, of course, you have the possibility of human rights and environmental issues, which I think would be somewhat subdued because of the nature of the consortia that are involved. You no longer have single companies going in as leaders. You have it almost like three-way splits, and so that if one company is not behaving responsibly, the others could bring it to book. What are some of the opportunities, just very quickly? It's a possible fiscal boon for African countries, the potential to invest strategically in infrastructure and raising quality of life. There's also the possibility, as I mentioned earlier, of using competition to Africa's advantage, rather than just being takers, but also being part of the negotiation strategy. And I think that in order to optimize the benefits of this resource boon, we need to do 5 things really quickly. 1, manage expectations. It's a lot of gas, but if you look at the amount of total recoverable assets in East Africa, crude, 28 billion. Nigeria alone has 37 billion. Libya, 47. So it is a lot, but it is not like Saudi Arabia type. So we have to manage expectations. We also have to ensure that we take a long-term view to policy formulation in the countries, because the benefits are going to accrue over a really long duration of economic usefulness. Thirdly, we need to start right now with critical investments in not just infrastructure, but training of the workforce, so that the domestic economy will be more fully integrated in the supply chain of these major economic activities. Fourth, we need to see the corporate sector as partners. So a new model of public-private partnership has to evolve. That will by necessity involve other non-state actors like NGOs and CSOs. And fifthly, we need to make sure that the companies and the government all adhere to international standards as relates to not just the industry, but also things like social welfare, environmental protection, and lives and livelihood. Thank you.
Thank you. Before we open up the questions, I thought I'd pose a couple of questions to the panel in general. And the first is we listened to John's description of public perception in terms of corruption and the ability to do business and the legal capacity and infrastructure within East Africa. And then we listened to the opportunities involved with the oil. There seems to be two different sides to the story. I was wondering if you could address from a doing business in Ethiopia perspective and doing business in East Africa versus reality on the ground versus what the Gallup is saying in terms of perceptions of the population.
Should I take that? Okay, well, I think that there is a psychological, we all human beings have a psychological condition where it's cognitive bias. That means that we're all biased towards the things that we've seen ourselves with our own eyes or experienced ourselves. So that to us is reality. So anything that's kind of out of that realm is out of the bounded reality, as psychologists say. Vis-a-vis Ethiopia, the image of Ethiopia has been shaped by well-intentioned rock stars. They meant well, but that's what people saw. And 30 years later, the perception still is changing, is of starving desert, so on and so forth. If you recall, when we think of Turkey, EastWest Institute does a lot of work in Turkey. For the longest time, everybody thought of Turkey. Remember the movie Midnight Express? Mm-hmm. That's what people thought of Turkey. That's changed. So the perception of Ethiopia and East Africa and Africa is going to change. But it's going to be done by getting people to come and see the reality. For business people, we have an opportunity because there's a mispricing of risk. It's not as risky as people think it is. Of course, when everybody wakes up, those opportunities and returns will go down. But right now, there's a massive misperception of risk. So that's positive for business people who are there, but slightly negative for attracting new investors. So that's kind of my thinking on that front.
Just to add on one thing, we should understand that still the Horn of Africa is still in a state building effort. There is a state building going on in the Horn of Africa. And since that process is an ongoing one, you will have challenges, but it also creates opportunities. So, state building in Ethiopia, federal structure, slowly taking roots. State building in other countries, new states emerging in the Horn of Africa. So there is an ongoing state building effort in the Horn of Africa. In that process, there are difficulties, there are challenges, but this can be addressed so long as the states are assisted in terms of creating institutions of governance, decentralization, popular participation, etc., etc. So one has to understand that dynamism, the dynamism of state building, which is an ongoing process in the Horn of Africa.
Yeah. On the corruption, broader East Africa, I do some work with U.S. government advisors going to Afghanistan, and one of the seminars I hold for them is on corruption in Afghanistan. And a challenge I pose to them, and I'll pose to you as well, is let's see if we could conduct a conversation about investment issues in this context without using the word corruption. Let's discuss all the things we normally talk about on the negative side and not use the word corruption. You'll find it difficult because most people really don't know what they're talking about when they say corruption, but people have different perceptions of what corruption actually is. So that's one point. Let's look at what the actual issues are, and rather than labeling that is not really helpful. But in terms of mispricing risk, one of the issues there is the information asymmetry. People really don't know that much about the market, because if you compare their market structure, regulatory frameworks, institutional capacity in East Africa with a number of other markets, emerging markets in different parts of the world, they're similar, and in some cases worse. But foreign direct investment flows to those areas and not to the African markets, because I think there's this asymmetry of information people are only now discovering. And so I think that as people start getting a better sense of what the issues are, they would have a different calculus. The calculus usually, when you have information asymmetry and where you have this mispriced risk, you're entering a potentially high-risk environment, and the contracting you're doing is high-value, low-frequency. So where normally as an investor you would be thinking of your 25, 30-year term horizon, you constrain it because you say, oh, maybe there'll be a coup. Maybe something will happen, I don't know. So you start thinking about how do you maximize returns on the front end? And that's a major push for corruption on both sides. So I think that as we clear this information asymmetry, we'll start thinking logically and responsibly in much longer terms, and that push for the high value, low frequency type calculus would be diminished.
I'd like to turn a little bit to China, because I know that you talked about how there's some misperceptions. I look at my experience in Afghanistan, and as the Chinese came in to develop the copper in the eastern part of Afghanistan, they caused a significant amount of problems with jealousies between warlords and creating more friction than they actually were able to control in that process. And as you know, the press in the United States looks at China as a growing consumer of energy and not having enough natural resources within its own boundaries, and looking at Africa as a place to exploit the resources there. And then what are the social and economic impacts of that, both on the negative and the positive side in terms of infrastructure, increased economy, but on the other side, importing their own workers, and so that the folks in East Africa aren't getting the benefit of that employment. I was wondering if you would mind expanding a little bit on that misperception, or if it is a misperception.
I can speak of Ethiopia, Chinese role in Ethiopia, for example. In other countries, I hear Chinese importing their labor force to do their business. I have visited Equatorial Guinea, I have seen that. But in Ethiopia, there are laws, there are rules. The rules are you can't import labor if you have the supply locally. You can import extraordinary, brilliant guys, managers, or executives, but in terms of labor force, so long as you have it, you can't import labor. So in Ethiopia, you will see some Chinese. It doesn't mean that it's all clean. But so long as you have those rules, the way Chinese bring labor force to Ethiopia will always be challenging, difficult. The rules are there. So long as you have those rules, that is manageable. In terms of investment, China looks Ethiopia as an anchor, is a place that you can move in the Horn of Africa. They look at that. So their investment is based on that, on having access to South Sudan, South Sudanese oil, to Great Lakes, They see that the connection, for example, Ethiopian Airlines has China, this line. So even to Angola, they use Ethiopian Airlines, for example. So Chinese investment in Ethiopia is, as I said, on major infrastructure developments. They build roads, highways, etc., etc. And the government allocates money for that. So it is a mutual benefit for Chinese investors and the Ethiopian government. You have access to finance from Chinese banks, Exim Bank, and the government allocates that. The government gives guarantees to the private companies. So the way they do business in Ethiopia is a little bit different, in my view. Teddy can talk comparatively in other African states, probably. But in Ethiopia, that is the way Chinese investment is done. Sometimes they do it for free, sometimes with a little bit of profit. Like, for example, I recall European Union, according to the Lome Convention between African and Caribbean countries and the European Union, they allocate resources for investments. Because Chinese companies come and run against European companies and they win contracts for infrastructure development. Because the Chinese look into a longer term and they look into making a small profit now so that they have access, they have that image, they have that capacity, they know the bureaucracy, so that a chain of other projects down the road will come. I will not be surprised if I see Chinese taking Gilgil-Gibe 3, 4, 5 in terms of electricity generation, building those chains of investments, huge investments. So the Chinese go into a system with a small profit, a very small profit. But once they are in, they know how to play in the politics and in the economics as well. Don't forget, a Chinese company will not even say whether democracy must be there or not. They do their business. They do their investments. So Teddy can say the way they do business in other countries. But in Ethiopia, this is a framework. The framework is much more clear. The government has a partnership with a company, and the investment, there is finance. Don't forget, Chinese have this policy, for example. Ethiopia can export anything to China so long as you have the capacity. There is no restriction. There is no restriction. Anything. If you have markets to China, no restriction. You can export to China anything that you can produce, so long as you have a market, no restriction. So these are some of the policies. Entering markets in the US or in Europe is challenging for Ethiopia's goods. Even some of the best coffee, you will have difficulty. But the Chinese allow those frameworks. How do Western markets, of course, create those frameworks for their companies to invest easily and then export to those markets?
Well, I think there are certainly different, varying views on this subject. But if you look at historically, Chinese, when they went out to do trade, as opposed to maybe other types of people, didn't impose their philosophy in the area they were going, whether it's Christianity or Islam or other philosophies. They've never done it historically. They essentially want to do business and they want to trade. China is a world power. Why? Because of its growing, I think probably the second largest economy in the world. But if you look at, it's not a global power, however. There's a big difference between a world power and a global power. Their per capita income is still around $5,000. That's pretty low. And China does not have the power projection abilities that the US has. They're far, far from it. So I think there are probably global perceptions of China. And of course, they're being pushed, Chinese leadership is being pushed to throw a bit of his weight around, which is against its nature. Huh? They're saying you should, now that you're such a world power, you should play a role in global governance. They have no interest in that, in my opinion. So it's within that framework you have to imagine how they do business in Africa. They don't have ideological imprint. They don't want to put any ideology in anybody. They want to do business. This is my thinking. Clearly, as Abdetta says, in Ethiopia, for example, foreign or Chinese are not allowed to do retail trade. In a lot of African countries, they are. So they come in and they displace the mom and pop shops and so on and so forth because of the costs. They get very cheap goods from China. So that will have social ramifications, and there will be some blowback, and I think that is beginning. So, if the African countries don't have the institutions to protect their economies, then you can't blame the Chinese from going in and doing what they're doing. So I think it's a combination of both institutional building within the African context, and then the Chinese being aware that there is going to be blowback from them going into the retail space and taking jobs away from that sector.
Dr. Gilpin, do you have any?
I just want to give you a sense of what's emerging over the last 2-3 years in East Africa's oil and gas sector. China is there, obviously, as are many others. But we notice a kind of differentiation. In the gas concessions, we see China part of a consortium, mainly downstream, building roads, infrastructure, whereas in oil, they still have upstream interests. That has a lot to do with China's, the characteristics of energy demand domestically in China, but also their comparative advantage. So unlike historically, when in many cases they were the lead player in the consortium, now they're either one among equals or subordinate partner in the consortia. So a lot of the concerns that we have heard historically, I think are going to be muted when you look at what's emerging in East Africa. A lot of the institutional and regulatory issues Teddy mentioned have now been taken into consideration in not just negotiations, but also in domestic sector reform. And so we see, as I said earlier, competitive consortia being more the order of the day in East Africa's emerging petroleum-rich states than a single dominant player in a particular country. And that is bringing competition, and I think it is good for the African countries. But the differentiation in oil and gas is one that is important to note.
Jim, one last point on that.
Yeah, John.
One of the things a lot of countries are wondering when they're making a move into a particular market, how do they quantify their soft power within that particular country? If we read in what Joseph Nye talks about with soft power, the only way to quantify it is through surveys. So we did that with China and the United States and virtually every country in the world. So we asked people, do you approve or disapprove the job performance of the leadership of the United States? Then we asked them, do you approve or disapprove the job performance of China? So where does that stack up? We have some qualitative information about the current state of China and Africa, and also the United States and Africa. But the most interesting thing is that when you look at it at a regional basis, the place where the United States gets its highest marks, Africa. Maybe not a surprise, much higher approval ratings than the U.S. leadership gets in the United States, some around 80, 90%. But here's the interesting thing. It's also the same region where China gets its highest approval ratings. So when you talk about the context in terms of a country's soft power, right now, China's is strong. However, that trend line is in decline, so it is eroding. So I think it's important to kind of look at from the qualitative perspective, but also the quantitative perspective, what is the current state, and that's what it looks like.
Great.
But just a quick footnote, Two Finger. It's also important to realize that moving forward, the relationship is not going to be zero-sum. It's going to be more collaborative. It's going to have to be more collaborative.
Yeah, one last thing on that is that we ask people, do you think there are too many Chinese in your country, and do you think there are too many Americans? And you can see that there is data that suggests that citizens within the African countries where we survey say, yes, there is too many Chinese people within the country, yet the numbers aren't as high for Americans. So again, looking at that soft power context, you have to bundle all of those things together.
What I'd like to do is turn it over to you guys who patiently waited to ask your questions, and open the floor up to questions. Please ask a question as opposed to making a statement. But, sir, you're first. Yeah. And we have microphones coming around if you can, please.
If we can identify themselves. They can identify themselves, so there.
Hi, I'm Jim Baker from the Clinton Foundation. And my question was, this is really exciting and obviously has a huge impact. What's your sense of the timing that it will take for money to actually flow into the countries from the oil and gas deposits you have?
Are you talking about revenue?
Yeah, revenue. Right.
Yeah, I think it depends. The offshore developments are huge. They're multi-billion-dollar developments in places like Mozambique, but in certain ways easier than onshore developments because it's offshore and you can essentially pipe the gas or LNG, ship the gas to wherever you need to do in Asia. So the numbers we're looking at is maybe 2017 for the Mozambique, somewhere around there, before you start seeing cash flow. Places like Kenya, Ethiopia, I think will probably be 2 to 3 years is my realistic timing for cash flow to come in. Maybe being a little aggressive there. But that's, maybe Mamadou is here. He could know any thoughts.
Yeah, I think it's, we're talking about for regular tax receipts, but we also have to take on board that countries make money from taxation, from fees, from bonuses, and fees and bonuses are already coming in, but those are one-shot deals. But the regular tax revenues and royalties, those will not accrue until the medium term, say for most countries between 4 to 6, maybe more years.
Any more questions? If you could identify yourself, please.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. Mamadou Bey with Chevron in Washington, D.C. I have a question on the, when you look at the whole region, one of the bottleneck for the oil-producing countries, so Uganda, which has already discovered, Kenya, Ethiopia, upcoming, South Sudan, we already know. How are you seeing how fast the infrastructure will be put in place in terms of pipeline, in terms of refineries, because some of the countries are focusing more on the refineries, like Uganda. How fast are you seeing development, and who's going to pay for it? One. Second, Mozambique and Tanzania, with the gas discoveries. I think that Theodoros 2017 is quite aggressive. Yeah. Because when you just look at most of the LNG projects, just take the Angola LNG, take a lot of many years to build it up. But more importantly, and I think Raymond alluded to this, is the need to really get a market, get a contract 20, 30 years with different buyers. And then so I would like to get your point of view on that aspect. Where are you seeing the market, knowing the shale gas discoveries also in Asia? How are you seeing the dynamic on that front?
Okay, let me start. In terms of infrastructure, it's not 2 questions, it's 1, because how fast and who will pay for it are linked. Who will pay for it is problematic. Initially, the assumption had been that the Chinese fiscal surplus would carry most of the burden, but we're now finding out that that's going to be a lot more difficult. So I think that the countries, and this is why in my remarks I said the challenge is not going to be so just transparency, but contracting. The countries are going to have to negotiate aggressive contracts that would include infrastructure, because for most of these countries, they have zero infrastructure at the moment, and that's going to take a lot of money. Who's going to pay for it? I think it's going to have to be a shared burden. The joint venture model that we are seeing emerge in most countries, I think, is going to be the way forward in terms of financing as well. Not just because of the availability of capital, but also because I think they would want to share the risk. Markets are problematic. We were discussing before this session exactly where all this demand will come from. We noticed that while the global price trend for natural gas is slightly bullish, it is quite depressed in the United States because domestically we're going to be facing an oversupply issue. And so being strategic in terms of where the markets are going to be, that's going to be of the essence. Definitely not China, because only 5% of market value in China is natural gas. Even if we have an expansion in terms of rural development, etc., the uptake over the next decade is not going to be sufficient to absorb. So we're thinking places like other Asian countries, near Asian countries, possibly India. I'm thinking about market size, but I think most of the East African countries should also look regionally to see, because we see, I think Chevron was part of a West African initiative to get gas from Nigeria all the way to, I think it's reached Cote d'Ivoire at the moment, or Ghana, but the game plan is for it to eventually to reach there. So I think they should also look at regional markets, but identifying those markets, I think, is crucial.
Yeah, I mean, I think you are right, but the one factor that we haven't talked about yet is climate change. As you saw in Beijing yesterday, basically the government's taking emergency measures due to the smog. I mean, you don't want your children to go outside in Beijing. It's pretty bad. So I think there's going to be a move away from coal to gas. So that could be one area where there's a market for this. Japan, we'll see if the nuclear, they're yo-yoing between shutting down all the nuclear power plants and then the recent Abe government putting them back on. I think Japan will be a big market, and of course South Korea could be a potential market. But if part of the regional integration and getting industries to use the gas within the African context, that's a massive potential demand as well.
Andy.
Andrew Nagorski, EastWest Institute. Two things. I'd like to get back more to the security issue, which a couple of you alluded to. I think Raymond Gilpin made the point that many of these resources are still in disputed areas. So how real are the security concerns? And then that gets into the issue of perceptions. Teddy Ashanafi made the point that they're often out of date, but isn't there also the additional problem that many investors look not just to East Africa, but kind of lump together everything, including Algeria and everything else, an incident like that, and sort of say, this whole area is unsafe. Fair or unfair, that's a reality you have to deal with.
The Horn is changing. The Horn of Africa is changing in terms of security. As I earlier said, the balance of force has changed. in my view, that shift in the balance of forces is a guarantee for security. Those resources, for example, if you see the oil and gas in southern Ethiopia, between Kenya and Ethiopia borders, that is not contested. That is not difficult. There are challenges in Ethiopian Somali region, a little bit, related to ONLF activities and so on and so forth. But that is also shifting because the balance of force has shifted. Teddy very well knows that because most of his investment is in that area. That is shifting. For example, the ONLF part of it is negotiating with the government. Some are in the process of negotiation. Slowly, I think that will be addressed. Yes, between the South and North Sudan, there are difficulties. Still, trust between the two parties is not there. For example, the North thinks, Northern Sudan or Khartoum thinks that if the South gets oil, the South will undermine the southern part of the North. Ethnic identities, historical struggle between SPLM and people living in those areas. So South Sudan, North Sudan, they have to come together and sort that out. So the security challenge will continue to be there so long as they couldn't sort that out between the North and the South. Somalia is changing. Somalia has a lot of prospect, by the way. Of course, most of Somalia's oil fields are being given concessions in the 60s and 70s. So issues of concessions are not going to be a problem because the concessions have been given long time ago. But in general, in my view, there is an improvement. And the trajectory from now down the road, I don't see huge conflict erupting in the Horn of Africa.
I think, we would like to hope that we don't see conflict, but I think the reality is that there are going to be points of friction. There have been suggestions that 7 out of 8 of the offshore blocks that Kenya granted might be contested by Somalia. We have other discussions in the Tanzania and Malawi, in Lake Malawi. Do you draw the border between the countries according to the 1890 Accord that Britain and Germany signed, or international law, which means half? Those issues exist. But what we are hoping is that the prosper thy neighbor doctrine would prevail, where countries will see it in their best interest to collaborate. We saw against all odds Nigeria and Cameroon do this over the Bakassi Peninsula. We've seen joint development zones de facto emerging, and one would hope that this becomes the trend. As far as what some literature refers to as Afro-pessimism, where hostage-taking in Algeria affects investment in South Africa, that's something that that hopefully over time, people will be sensitized not just to the diversity of the continent, but also to the folly of such illogic. And the boom in East Africa is going to be one, hopefully, would be a wake-up call that things are proceeding slightly differently, and there's an opportunity to look at models. Like I think Mamadou was telling me about the Kuwait-Saudi Arabia joint development. So there are models of collaboration. There's one between, I think, Malaysia and one of its neighbors, natural gas, again. I think Africa needs to look at models of cooperation now and start finding non-violent or non-violent ways of, or contentious ways of solving them. Because, the Prosper Thy Neighbor doctrine, I think, should be the way forward.
Raymond had an interesting point that one of the threats for this region is civil unrest. And one of the things that we've been working on is there a way to sort of quantify a coming civil unrest? I think it's the magic bullet that virtually all major organizations that are trying to quantify, that's the magic bullet that they're looking for. And we know two things. One, that it's regional, starts at a regional basis. You can't really take a macro level look at a country like the United States. Detroit looks far different from Nebraska, but it starts at the region. But the other piece is that it has to have some sort of matchstick event. What we can know now is whether or not the logs have been drenched with kerosene, but it needs some sort of matchstick event to get things started. Now the question is, how do you determine whether or not a country has logs drenched in kerosene? We think, again, we haven't shown this, we're only into 7 years of trending, but we think there are 4 things that provide a leading indicator on whether or not there are countries that look like that. The first one is the job situation. Not just raw unemployment, but whether or not people have quality jobs. And so we've worked on this new metric called payroll to population, and we can see that in 2011, Tanzania was 3rd from the bottom in terms of the worst job situation in the world. But in addition to that, there's another metric right on jobs, which is whether or not people have hope to get a good job. Because you may have a poor job situation, but if people have that immediate hope to get a good job, things aren't as brittle as one might think. Then there are 2 other elements. The third element is whether or not hunger is becoming a problem within the country. Hunger estimates are very hard to get a fix on. FAO, I think, made an estimate that 1 billion people around the world are hungry 4 years ago. They adjusted that figure about 2 months ago. So we're still in that search to get a more precise number. We believe that we have one that helps us get an understanding, but that's the third element. And then the fourth one is, of course, this piece on corruption. Because if you have a jobs problem, then no hope to get a good job, a hunger problem, all in combination with the fact that you can't get a fair shake and you think that the system is working against you, we think that those might be the 4 circumstances, all things that you can quantify. And again, 4 things that we're looking at that are really troubling some of these countries, particularly Tanzania when we look at the microdata. So I think when we're talking about civil unrest, that is a real threat and something that you can see in the data.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you very much. My name is Lucy Kirudo from Kenya Embassy. Related to the issue of security, we know that in most part of Africa, where there are these resources, they have become a curse instead of a blessing. And it mainly includes politics of exclusivity. And I was just wondering if the East African governments are going to avoid this kind of curse. Do you think there are any measures, structures that these governments are putting in place so that they can avoid this? Are there models that we can, or are there efforts to learn from those countries that have used their resources well? Maybe the Honorable Minister could help us in that.
Better or?
Well, maybe I can give it a shot. I mean, I don't think that oil is a curse. I don't think resource is a curse. It's like a knife. You can use a knife to cook food and eat, or you could use it for, violence. It depends on what you do with it. You have countries like Botswana, Chile, Malaysia, who have resources and they're well managed. The one thing we have to be careful about here is we've been hearing about the Norwegian model. And Norway is a country that has a GDP of $485 billion, They have per capita income of $97,000, OECD country, and they have 5 million people. And you can't take that model and apply it to, say, Uganda, which has a GDP of $16 billion, and per capita income on a PPP basis of $1,300, and has 34 million people. I don't think you can put that model on them. I think that being said, it's how the resources are organized. And on that, I have some thoughts. For example, if you have, and Raymond touched upon this, it's about disaggregating ownership and control. So you have different models, and slightly complicated. One is you have state ownership with control. That means the state owns over 50% of the assets. The second model is state ownership without control. So you have PSAs, production sharing agreements, etc., but the state has 50% or owns less than 50% of that assets. And the third is private domestic companies, where private domestic company owns the rights, and they can own a majority share of 50%. And then the fourth is private ownership of those assets, foreign ownership. So private companies like Chevron can come and take 100% of those assets. So it's one of these four ways of controlling the oil and resources that will make the difference whether the resource curse is going to be there or not. I don't know if that's clear, but it's the way that resources control. I don't know, Raymond, if your thoughts.
I absolutely agree with you. We see it in a lot of literature, this resource curse, and we think anywhere you see oil and gas, you're going to see these problems. But it's actually the way you control and your model of economic governance. It's right. You don't take the Norwegian model, and ironically, when you talk to people in the Norwegian oil industry, they bristle at the mention of a Norwegian model. They say, "Oh, there is no Norwegian model. We are figuring it out as we go along." And I think that's what most African countries need to do, to move away from the hope that there is some silver bullet that's going to solve all the problems, to take a look at the problem set and see how you could improve governance. And from the governance side, it's not as complicated as the industry side, because all the government really needs to figure out what to do is to get a good deal as far as the contract is concerned, and then invest and spend its resources in a manner that is wise, that is just, and that is equitable. And I know I earlier said let's not think about models, but a country I always like to give as an example is Trinidad and Tobago. In the end of the 90s, early 2000, about 25% of all the natural gas the United States imported came from that tiny country. And if you look at Trinidad and Tobago in the 60s and 70s, it had many of the hallmarks of your typical developing country. Ethnic issues, political unrest, low capacity, but they focused a lot on investment, not just in infrastructure, but in people, to an extent that today, Trinidad's social indicators compare favorably across the board. And Trinidad is now exporting expertise in the gas industry because of those investments. It wouldn't happen overnight, but I think you're right, ma'am, that now is the time for these African governments to be thinking, what are the game changers that we need to be considering policy-wise, so that in 10, 15 years' time, it will be a completely different story. And I think now is the time to be thinking about those issues.
Any other questions?
I think there's one over there.
I'm sorry? Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Asmara. I'm from the U.S. Department of Energy. And I had a security question as well, but it's more related to on the waters. particularly piracy. So is there major concerns about when these LNG facilities come up in like Mozambique and potentially Tanzania, that as far as sending shipments, particularly between or to through the Bab el Mandeb, the choke point, which one of you guys mentioned, if they want to ship to Europe or other Asian countries, is there concerns about not having piracy in control by that time? And are there any collaborations that potentially they're trying to develop at this time? And I also have another question related to the export markets. I know we mentioned a lot about Asia being a major export market for the LNG in particularly, but are there concerns about Australia? Their gas developments are probably going to be up and running by that time as well. And so are they looking into maybe Latin American countries? I know that might be difficult because U.S. shale and stuff will probably target the Western Hemisphere, but it just seems like that concern about where they're going to actually ship to, the answer keeps on being Asia. But because of what's going on in Australia, I think that might be a little bit more difficult. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on that as well.
On piracy, I think the trend is going down. Piracy is going down. Most of it was related to governance issues in Somalia. In my view, the new government will be strengthened a little bit in terms of addressing the issues that come from the southern part of Somalia. I am not sure if Puntland will have the capacity to control everybody in Puntland. That is the area where there is a soft underbelly in terms of controlling all piracy activities. But so long as the new government in Mogadishu extends its influence into the areas very close to Puntland, for example, most of the pirates were coming like between Galkayo to Mogadishu previously. So if the government's security develops a little bit to that part, assisted by AMISOM, I think piracy will go down. At the same time, the international community is doing its part in terms of strengthening, monitoring the sea. You know, the Europeans have a lot of ships, military ships. The Americans, the Japanese, the Chinese have. There were arguments whether piracy was purposefully done by some companies that are making money out of it in terms of insurance and some big multinational companies involved in that. So the trend is on the downside in terms of piracy.
Looking ahead, the easy answer to piracy is yes, there'll still be a threat. But would it be a crippling threat or a serious threat? No, I don't think so. Even in its heyday, when piracy was at its highest, it was, I think, less than 0.6% of all ships got attacked at all. And so it was sensationalized by the media, but in terms of the impact on the industry and transit, it was a drop in the ocean. I talked to a number of ship owners, and they said, yeah, it's there, but our biggest problem now is this was back in, I think, 2005, 2006, I think. Said our biggest problem actually is the increase in Suez Canal transit fees. That's what's crippling us, not piracy. So we sensationalized it, but in terms of its impact on the industry, I don't think it will be that much. But in terms of optics, probably yes, but in actual fact, I don't think that much. The market question is a difficult one because technology is bringing a lot of unconventional reserves on the market. Over the next 10 years, we're going to have Australia, the United States, now East Africa, all coming on stream. And so that's why I said contracting is going to be the killer. Because how do you lock in market and price where there's such uncertainty over the medium term in terms of what the global demand and supply dynamics are going to be. I think the reason why we keep defaulting to Asia is because of size, market size, more than anything else. Is that aspirational and just a hope? Probably yes. But I think the sooner the African countries get in and lock in some deals, the better they're going to be in terms of ensuring that they do have somewhere to sell their, particularly gas. Oil is a little easier to deal with.
Yeah, I think we tend to underestimate demand. I mean, if you look back 20 years ago, it would have been very hard to imagine that the world is consuming this much resources, both oil and gas. So perhaps we're going to underestimate demand moving forward. I mean, clearly, the last 500 years, the West has kind of had the largest share of GDP in the world, and that's changing. And we're going back to the historical, over long-term norms of Asia and China, China and India being the largest component of world GDP. So, we still have a lot of Chinese who need to come out of poverty. So they're going to need energy. And I think there's going to be perhaps even an energy deficit.
But
20 years.
But I think China are currently locked in with Burma and Turkmenistan in terms of gas, and that's a problem. So even if you have a demographic expansion or market expansion there, their supply is, don't you think it's pretty much locked in?
Well, I think if that was the case, the Chinese wouldn't still be going out scouring for resources like gas in Africa. I think that clearly, by protecting shipping lanes and so on and so forth, know that they're vulnerable. So they need to have a diversified, I think, supply of resources because you don't know what happens. They're very long-thinking and careful, I thought.
Sir.
I had a second question. That is, what's your sense of the infrastructure in the various countries in order to deal with the new resources? In other words, the GIS systems, the mapping, all the kind of technical infrastructure that they need to really deal with the use of the resources. Are they in good shape, or what's the status of that?
Yeah, I think that's in pretty good shape. Of course, we don't have the pipelines and the pump stations and the refineries yet, but I think there's been a lot of capacity building in that regard, at least vis-a-vis Ethiopia, where we have the GIS systems. A lot of the technology, I think, is there. Are we there in terms of the optimal stage? No. We still need a lot of work to be done in terms of teaching the new crop of geoscientists, geologists, and so on and so forth, having that match curriculum with what the oil companies are going to need, and so on and so forth. There's going to be a lot of work to be done on that. But I think in order to get to where we need to get development, I think we're okay. Or if not, we can bring whatever is lacking from outside the countries. I don't know if you agree.
I agree.
Hey.
I think it will be difficult to precisely say this is what an average Ethiopian will think about developments in Ethiopia. You can concentrate on cities and towns where information access is there. But in Ethiopia, part of the change is also in the countryside, the way agricultural commodities are getting their prices, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, you see a lot of hope. People really looking forward to changes that are emerging in Ethiopia. But it is difficult to quantify it, to say this number of Ethiopians believe that from here to there, that they will be there. It's very difficult to quantify it. But there is optimism. You'll see, you can see from the media the way the Horn of Africa is portrayed in the international media in a better way compared to previous way of reporting in the Horn. I think Teddy and his colleagues were doing a nice public relations job as well in hosting some of international conferences related to economic development in Africa in Addis. So there is a feeling, there is an ongoing feeling among average Ethiopians, but it's difficult to quantify, to show. And don't forget, in Ethiopia still, the majority of Ethiopians live in the countryside. Agriculture still controls like 80% of the labor force. So eventually with developments, infrastructural growth, etc., you can feel it. But that is now concentrated in around cities and towns.
I think Raymond is right. We have to be, well, the governments have to be careful about managing expectations because the oil industry is very capital intensive. It's not really labor intensive. Obviously, there will be ancillary businesses which will, in terms of local, domestic suppliers, local resource, local content rules will make companies develop around this industry. But it's not going to employ a lot of jobs yet, but it's capital intensive. So obviously there will be a psychological boost for the country, and the governments also would like to maybe use it for political leverage. Normal, it's understandable. But we must be very careful on managing expectations all around.
Yeah, if you mine local media, the local newspapers, or listen to local FMs in Tanzania, Uganda, Kenya in particular, there are very heightened expectations that need to be mined, that need to be managed. But there's also a lot of caution because people fear that it's going to go the way of the other petroleum-rich states in Africa where a few will benefit and the others would not. And so there's a lot of euphoria, but also a lot of caution.
I think one of the biggest challenges, expectations, is spot on, and there's a way to quantify it by asking people where they think they'll be. And we've seen some countries in the world where they think they're going to be too high, and when those expectations aren't met, the outcomes aren't great. But the second piece, is there sort of a silver bullet in terms of ensuring sustainable, high well-being? And the one thing that leadership within every single one of these countries has to keep in mind is that there has to be some form of earned success. And those two words are key. And the reason it's earned success is because from what all the research suggests is that when funds, money, cash, whatever you want to call it, is rained down on whether it's an individual or a group of people, if that was not earned, the same blast in terms of well-being is not realized. So it's very key that there's earned success along the way. You can see it at a micro level in the United States. Studies have been done on people that have won the lottery. And what they find is that those people, their happiness, their well-being, whatever you want to call it, there was a temporary boost, but it was not sustainable. And they've even done studies on individuals, whether they make $80,000 or $800,000, it all turns on whether or not they believe that they earn that success. So that's the major thing that I think leadership needs to keep in mind is that as all this is happening, they need to see at a macro level, how do people really feel like they've earned success and that money, revenue wasn't just sort of rained down on the country.
We've got time for one more question.
There's one.
Anthony Mansell with the International Emissions Trading Association. I wanted to ask something on the resource curse idea as well. One thing that you notice with countries that get a lot of investment in sort of mineral extraction or oil or gas sectors is the impacts on currency, usually a level of appreciation. And given a lot of what we've talked about the need for sustainable jobs and rapid currency appreciations can drive out domestic export industry. It can also make a country more reliant on imports. Is that part of the calculus here on civil unrest? Is there any kind of insights that you have on how just the general monetary aspects of this can impact the region? Because it has been seen in other places that a rapid appreciation can cause a sort of an economic shock in that sense.
I mean, I think my Dutch friends don't like to hear it, but it's called the Dutch disease. And that's essentially you crowding out a lot of investment in other sectors. From the standpoint, at least from Ethiopia, I know the leadership, the political leadership, is very aware of this. And they want to make sure that once the resources are there, that it's not going to crowd out a lot of other industries. So they want to use this as a catalyst to develop other industries. And clearly, I think for some people who have, let's say, hard currency constraints, it's a good problem to have. So I think that it's going to be a manageable situation.
Yeah, and if you look back to the history of the Dutch disease, it was basically a positive price shock in the 70s that forced the windfall gains that the Dutch government enjoyed that destabilized the currency. The point being that in most of East African countries, this is going to be a planned receipt rather than a windfall. And so my guess would be that a lot of the central banks and treasuries now should be planning both currency and reserves management policies to absorb the intake such that it is not destabilizing. But will it be destabilizing to some extent? Yes, because the currency is going to appreciate. We're going to see competitiveness wane. And this is where we need to start thinking about trade options. One question being in Washington, D.C. would be, what could we do with the African Growth and Opportunities Act, AGOA, to start preparing, because we know it's coming down the pike. Could we say maybe textiles in Kenya and anticipate that by 2017, to take an optimistic horizon, we'll be expecting X% much more in terms of inflows, so we are going to see a temporary appreciation or a gradual appreciation. What should we be doing right now in terms of market access to make AGOA more friendly to these countries that will be experiencing this macroeconomic shock? I think those are questions that we should be asking on both sides of the Atlantic to prepare for what we know would be realignment of the exchange rate.
I'd like to personally thank everyone on the panel, and let's give them a round of applause. Thanks. An exceptional way to spend the morning, and I'm sure if there's further questions or follow-on that the gentleman here would be available to any follow-on questions. Thank you again to Gallup. And, John, thank you very much.